Let's hope I don't fall off the first step.
I worried about that a lot at first too.
This morning, if you do want to listen, I'm going to read from the book of Psalms, Psalms chapter 2. Read the whole chapter, all 13 verses. So if you want 12 verses, I'm sorry. Anyway, here's the way the psalm goes. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers gather together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Let us break their chains, they say, and throw off their fetters. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will proclaim the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father, and asked of me, I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will rule them with an iron scepter. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. Therefore, you kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you be destroyed in your way. For his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are those who take refuge in him. Now, if I had to put a name on this lesson today, I would entitle this lesson, Rebels of the World Unite. Now you might say that's a funny way to call it, but the reason I say this is because if everyone on earth got together in a united effort against God, that would be their only hope, and even then they would not succeed. This psalm that I just read to you shows God's judging side, while other psalms have looked at to show his graciousness, his awesomeness, and they are indeed to give comfort to those who read these psalms and make them more assured that God is in control and God is going to make things come out for our good. So, it should be a comfort to the Christian, especially if all the kings, all the rulers, we don't think of kings that much anymore, do we? But we think of rulers, and if they all conspire against God, and there are some nations that are, even right now as we speak and think, conspiring against God. How can we banish Christianity? How can we get away from these Christians worshiping together? And they're always trying to think of things that they can do to get rid of Christians. And a lot of them are doing exactly that. They're murdering them. They're putting them to death. They're banishing them from any kind of way even to make a living. But if they are doing this, even if they conspired against God, it would not be enough to wipe out Jesus. And we can, if you're a historian, you can look back from the beginning of the church, the day of Pentecost. You can look from then until now, and you will see different stages of history where men have tried to wipe out Christianity. And always, guess what? It's always resulted in failure. And it really hasn't happened that many times in history. But actually, in a way, it happened to a very small degree during David's time. And that's why I believe he could have written this song, because he was hearkening back to those times whenever these things, there were men that were conspiring against him and his family and against God, because they didn't want him to be the king of Israel. And so they tried to wipe out his family. They tried many different things to get rid of David. And especially because they wanted to keep Saul as their king, even though he was a failure in many accounts. But nevertheless, they tried to wipe out him, his family, anything to do with him. And but guess what? They couldn't thwart God's plan. So it didn't take long for them to realize that David truly, indeed, was God's chosen man, God's chosen one. And this passage also, we have to look at it maybe in light of Jesus too, because it's also typical of Jesus. For it's quoted by Paul in the book of Hebrews, and he says there, "You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness." And of course, that passage applied to Christ. And the psalm also, if you take it, you can also say that, well, this psalm also applies to Jesus as well. But now, you have to remember back when David went against this rather tall man. I'm sure that all of y'all probably have heard that story, haven't you? I've heard it since I was a little boy. It was one of my favorite stories in the Bible because David went up against this, what we might call, giant. I did some research on that, and really there were men in Canaan that were what you and I would probably call giants. Now today, there have been men in history that were what we might call giants, not in a physical sense, not so much in any other kind of sense, but just physically. And of course, some of them became famous, and they kind of captured that by saying, "I'm the tallest man in the world. I'm 7 feet something inches tall." There was even a guy many years ago that was a wrestler, and he capitalized on that fame of being a tall man. Of course, usually these people did not live long lives. And the same is true of this man the Philistines had. He was like their #1 champion. And of course, we all remember it being Goliath. And of course, David said that when he was challenging the Israelites. He was mocking them. He was also mocking the God of the Israelites, and that is the God of heaven. And he was putting God in derision and saying that, hey, if your God's so great, come on, show us what you got. Heard that before too, haven't you? And so David is the one that volunteered for this task. Well, we know the story from the standpoint that they said, okay, well, we'll need to equip you with a suit of armor. They tried putting Saul's armor on him, but it just kind of like swallowed him up. So who's this puny little shepherd boy, they asked. And of course, and Saul was, he was probably at least 6 foot tall. We gathered that from the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, that Saul was a rather tall man himself. He wasn't like Goliath, because it was estimated that he was over 7 feet tall. Now, the Dallas Mavericks have a player that's 7 feet, I forget, it's 7 feet, so many inches tall. 7 feet 2? Okay, thank you. And now I've never actually met Dirk, but I've seen him, and when you put him up against other players that aren't as tall, he does look like a really tall guy. Anyway, so he's, we know at least 7 feet 2. But anyway, that's pretty tall. And of course, he's made the best of it too in his career. But of course, then we all know what happened, that all the army of Israel that was camped out or camped across from where the Philistines were. None of them wanted to go against Goliath, but David did, and we all know what happened with this little slingshot. And he was able, and it was not that he did it himself. It was God working through him that he made the mistake of criticizing their God, the God of heaven, and of course the stone that he put is what did him in. But his big mistake, of course, was not going just against the Israelites, but going against their God. And that's how David put it as well. Because number one, he was going against God's anointed one, and that was David. And of course, with that, nothing could defeat them. So they wanted to be against the Lord. They wanted to crush the Israelites, but they forgot that their God was greater than just David than anything they might have. So they didn't want to be, you might say, reined in, because they wanted to reign. They did not want to be under the rule of God. Now, there are some people like that today, as we all know, but praise the Lord that they're not totally united against God. But suppose they were. The devil is trying to get folks organized against the children of God. His people, the devil's people that is, want to serve him more than the people of God do sometimes in sharing the Great Commission with the world. Now, maybe you might, when we read this psalm here, shake a little bit when we read verse 3, because he says there, let us break their chains, they say, and throw off their fetters. And the one enthroned in heaven laughs. That's what God does at them when they try to do these kind of things. So, and we see, of course, from this, the scorn that God has for them wanting to do things like this. And he laughs. Now, he doesn't laugh like I told you a funny joke or something that he's laughing at that. He laughs kind of like in a derisive sort of way, in that you laugh at me. I mean, after all, God is the creator of the universe and everything in it. And so it's more like a scorn that they have for God. But he's not pleased with them. And it's more like contempt that he has for them. And so don't be afraid of what man may try to do to stamp out God's people. They may be many, but the forces of evil are many, but with God's help, we are mighty. And just remember that. If you're ever reading this psalm, remember that when it seems like people can't accept what God has done. And so don't be afraid of what man might do to stamp out Christianity and or Christians. And they may be many, but like I say, we are mighty. Remember that. Please remember that. It's the broad way, of course, that leads to destruction, and many there are that find it. There has never been a time when God's army was in the majority, and there probably never will be. If you look back through history, at times when it seemed like the whole world was going crazy, and it was doing things that were leading to destruction. And of course, we're still seeing that a lot in today. I need to get a drink of water. I'm sorry. My mouth is getting dry too, so please bear with me. And all you have to do is to further develop this story that, and again, we all remember the story in the Old Testament. Again, it was one of my favorite stories growing up, and it's a story of Gideon and all the things that happened. And I could spend the rest of the morning talking about Gideon and what happened with him and how he tested God and God tested him. Remember, they were going against the Midianites. The Midianites were camped not far from where the Israelites were, and they were harassing them at every turn, it seemed like. Every time the Israelites, they would get a crop, and guess what? The Midianites would come in and they would destroy it, or they would just take it for themselves, mainly. And of course, the people then cried out to God. But all this happened simply because the people of God, the Israelites, they had forgotten God. They had forgotten all the things that He had done for them. So they went to Baal worship. And some people pronounce that Baal, but anyway, you know what I'm talking about. And they cried out to God, and God sent them a person to deliver them, and that, of course, was the person of Gideon. And he called the Israelites. He said, okay, if you want to read about this, it's in the book of Judges, chapter 6 and 7, and part of 8. But when he first made the call for the Israelites to come together, let's defeat the Midianites. Well, 32,000 Israelites showed up, men ready to go to battle and go to war. And of course, we know what happened. God said, no, that's way too many. Now keep in mind, the Midianites, and it says this in the Bible, they had 120,000 men camped just across the way there, where the Israelites, now they had 32,000 men. Wow, that's really great, isn't it? But God said, nope, that's too many. I mean, after all, the odds then were only 3 to 1. In other words, 3 Midianites for every 1 Israelite. So, of course, then we know the story how that they did several tests until they came to the water test. And by then, at one time they had 10,000, and then they narrowed it down to 300. 300, okay? God said, now you've got enough to defeat the Midianites. And, of course, anybody today looking at that number and figure and knowing the other army that they were going against would say, hey, that's crazy. You can't do that. I mean, actually, maybe you need 300,000 men. No, not with God on their side. So that's why 300 was enough. And of course, we all know what happened, because with God, they didn't need to be mighty in numbers. They need to be mighty in their devotion to God, in their trustworthiness of God and what He could do for them. They had to depend on God, and there was no one else they could turn to. So, what did they do? What would you have done? Hey, I'm going to go find an arms dealer, and I'm going to buy some machine guns and hand grenades and rockets and even some Scud missiles or whatever they are. And what did they do? No, they didn't do anything like this. They did get something, though, that was very important. They got a pitcher. I'm not talking about a pitcher, but I'm talking about the pitcher that you pour from. Okay, they got a pitcher, they got a torch, and they got a trumpet. Okay? That was the 3 things they needed for war. And of course, we all know, or we all should know, what happened after that. When Gideon lined them up and he said, okay, each person was in a different place around where the Midianites were camped. And of course, once they broke the pitcher and they saw the torch and blew the trumpet, guess what? The Midianites, they were panicked. Why do you think they were panicked? I mean, there were only 300 of them, but it was night, and they didn't realize that these 300 torches only represented 300 men, where they probably thought, and this is not in the Bible, so I'm just speculating now, but they probably thought that they had 300 divisions, because usually when they would go into war, they would have these battalions, and there were like maybe 3,000 men or maybe 30,000, I'm not sure which, but they would have these men, and that would be a battalion. So they thought that there were 300 or 3,000 men in each pitcher that was broken and trumpets that sounded, and they panicked. And what did they do when they panicked? They started stabbing each other, and they started killing each other, and they were trampling each other as well. It'd be kind of like, some of these games that they've had in years past where people trampled each other to get out of the stadium or to get away from maybe something bad that was happening. And so it wasn't so much that somebody was actually killing them, they were killing each other. And of course that's what happened to the Midianites, and they fled, and as they were fleeing they were still killing each other. And of course then the Israelites chased them down, and they finished destroying most of them. And of course then it wasn't so much that they had a good battle plan. No, this was God's plan. And the victory belonged not so much to the plot. I mean, it was a good plot though, right? If that was indeed the case. But the victory belonged to the people and them trusting in God. And it didn't belong to the unity of wickedness against God that the Midianites had. But the God who helped them defeat them was, like I said in the psalm here, he was laughing. Not laughing because it was funny, but laughing with scorn because he had given them the victory. And he talks about him rebuking them in his anger, because he terrifies them with his wrath. Then he goes on to say in the psalm, I have installed my king. So it doesn't matter how many plots you make, doesn't matter how many different scenarios you have for getting rid of David, and of course then when the Christians came along, it doesn't matter how many Christians, God is still in control, and that's why they're victorious. Of course, Jesus still rules in the lives of his people, because he is, after all, our King of Kings and Lord of Lords. There are other kings and other lords, but even if they all conspire against Jesus and his followers, Christians, they will not be able to destroy them, because God has installed his king, King Jesus Christ our Lord, and he reigns even today. Now, the psalm is actually divided into like maybe two sections here, and the second section begins in verse 7. He says, I will proclaim the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, to the ends of the earth your possession. You will rule them with an iron scepter. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. So I'm going to stop right there and remember that we have a king, King Jesus, and it says here, ask of the Father. Isn't that nice that we have a king that we could go to? We ask of the Father, and he gives what we ask for, right? If I were one of y'all, let's say, all of a sudden was anointed king over the world. Wow, wouldn't that be great? We'd say, well, we've got a front row seat here, don't we? But anyway, it's not so much like that. But if there was a king likes to do things for his subject, a good king that is, and they have the right to bestow gifts on their people. So that would be the first thing I would do if I were king. I would want to bestow gifts on my people because that's what glorifies the king. I hope that's true, don't you? And I hope that's what you would want to do as well. But Jesus is on the throne. We know that for sure. And he asks us, well, do you want the nations? Do you want my scepter in your hand to rule? You will rule the world with a rod of iron, he said. It doesn't, so that in that sense, it doesn't matter how much they conspire against our King Jesus. If Jesus is on the throne, the church is in control. We possess then the power of God. Paul even says this in 1 Corinthians, the first chapter. He says, all things are yours, even the world. So, all things are yours and mine. If, that's a big if too, right? If we belong to Christ. So, it starts a new thought then in verse 10, and that is, therefore, you kings, be wise, be warned, you rulers of the earth. And he says, in there also, he says, serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling, because after all, he is a mighty one. Then he says something in verse 12. 11 was serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Then he says in verse 12, kiss the Son, lest he be angry. That's unusual, isn't it? Why have that? Kiss the Son. Well, actually, if you go back and study, and we're not going to go through a Greek lesson or a Hebrew lesson right now, but there are actually 3 words for kiss in the Bible. You remember when Jacob and Esau were out looking for each other? You remember that? And they kind of parted company, and Jacob thought Esau was out to kill me. So he was kind of like fleeing for his life. But in a way, that wasn't the story at all. When they finally did meet, like Esau was on one side of the river, and then Jacob was on this side, and Jacob said, okay, I'm going to go across the river and meet with Esau. Now, he may kill me, but leave my wives and flocks and herds and children. I'm going to leave them here away, so he won't destroy them as well. Well, guess what happened when the 2 brothers met? They embraced each other. It says they kissed one another. Now, of course, it's a kiss of joy, how glad they were that, hey, I'm not out to kill you. Well, I thought you were. No, I'm out to embrace you as my brother, and, things like that. So, that would be the kiss then among equals. They were equal. And there's another kiss that talks about as one kissing the inferior is kissing the superior. In the case of Samuel, when he anointed David as king, now, and Samuel kissed David, because why? Because David as king then was superior, and Samuel kissed him. So it was more like a kiss of honor and respect for the kiss. And then the third use of the word kiss is when one kisses another, he has the right to determine my life or death. And of course, Judas did this when he kissed Jesus hypocritically. Remember, he didn't have he thought he did at the time, and so that's why he kissed Jesus. Okay, this is the man you want. So that's how he betrayed him, with a kiss. That's the one that is used there. But the fact that what he's telling us here, kiss the Son, lest he be angry. In other words, give him the respect and the honor that he deserves. And that's the kiss that is used here. So in a way, it's kind of an unusual revelation about Jesus, because we don't normally think about Jesus in this way, because he says that if we do not do this, lest he be angry and you be destroyed in your way, for his wrath can flare up in a moment. We don't normally think about Jesus in this way. We think about Jesus meek and mild, and we think about him some kind of like in a goody-goody sort of way, but that's only a concept we have of Jesus. But we need to rethink and realize that our Lord is a consuming fire. He tells us that in Hebrews 12 and verse 29. And so what he's trying to tell us here is that kiss the Son, in other words, give honor and respect to the Son, because he deserves it. It is like the inferior going to the superior, and that is Jesus Christ our Lord. So, if you haven't kissed Jesus on a daily basis, then you better hope that you don't see him until you've learned to respect, honor, and obey him. And of course, then the last phrase he talks about then is if you want safety, he says, blessed are those who take refuge in him. So in the first century world, Rome was the power. Rome was the world power at that time. But guess what? When the Christians came along, they soon became trouble to Rome. Because why? Because Rome thought that they had their king that they were going to install, and they wanted to stamp out Christianity. So that's the other time in history that we can look back and say, yes, there were men that were trying to wipe out Christianity. But of the 30 emperors that Rome had that conspired against Christianity, it was interesting to me, in a way, it's kind of morbid, I guess, but it's interesting to me what happened to these 30 emperors, especially those that were conspiring to wipe out Christianity. I got to take a look at it.